What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when Harrison Ford confronted Jimmy Kimmel over his relentless mocking of older actors, leading to an explosive on-air meltdown that ended with the legendary star storming off set. "Harrison Ford, everybody," Kimmel announced with exaggerated enthusiasm, his voice carrying that particular tone he reserved for guests he planned to toy with. "The man who's been dodging retirement longer than most people dodge their taxes." The audience laughed, but Ford's expression remained stone-faced, his eyes narrowing slightly at the host's opening salvo. Ford leaned back in his chair, studying Kimmel with the same intensity he'd once brought to interrogating suspects as Rick Deckard. "Well, Jimmy, some of us believe in actually working for our money instead of just making jokes about people who do." The comeback landed with surgical precision, drawing nervous laughter from the audience and a visible flinch from Kimmel, who clearly hadn't expected such immediate pushback. The host quickly pivoted to his prepared material, but his rhythm was already disrupted. "So, Harrison, you're 81 years old and still doing action movies. At what point do we start worrying about you breaking a hip during a fight scene?" Kimmel's question drew some chuckles, but there was an uncomfortable undercurrent in the studio. Ford's jaw tightened perceptibly. "At what point do we start worrying about talk show hosts actually developing some talent?" Ford shot back without missing a beat. The audience gasped audibly, sensing the shift in dynamics. This wasn't the usual playful banter between host and guest. There was real tension crackling between these two men. Kimmel's face flushed red, but he pressed forward with his prepared jokes, each one more pointed than the last. "I mean, come on, Harrison. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny? More like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Medicaid, am I right?" He gestured toward his band leader and writers off stage, seeking validation for his increasingly desperate attempts at humor. Ford sat in silence for a long moment, his legendary composure beginning to crack. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of Han Solo confronting Jabba the Hutt. "You know, Jimmy, I've been doing this for 50 years. I've worked with some of the greatest directors in cinema history, created characters that will outlive both of us, and I've done it without having to tear down other people to get a laugh." The studio fell eerily quiet. Even Kimmel's band seemed to sense that something was shifting beyond the usual late-night entertainment formula. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he'd pushed too far, attempted to backtrack with a nervous laugh. "Hey, come on, Harrison, it's all in good fun. We're just having some laughs here." But Ford wasn't backing down. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice growing stronger and more pointed. "No, Jimmy, this isn't fun. This is what passes for comedy now. Making fun of people's age? Mocking actors who've dedicated their lives to their craft? You sit behind this desk every night and take cheap shots at people who've actually accomplished something." Kimmel's carefully constructed persona began to crumble as he realized his usual deflection tactics weren't working. "Look, Harrison, I think you're taking this a little too seriously. It's comedy. It's what we do here." His voice carried a defensive edge that his regular viewers had rarely heard. "What you do here," Ford replied, his words measured and deliberate, "is tear people down for entertainment. You've made a career out of punching down at people, hiding behind the excuse of comedy, while you systematically mock and belittle anyone who threatens your fragile ego." The audience was completely silent now, witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television. Ford's decades of frustration with Hollywood's treatment of veteran actors was pouring out in real time, and Kimmel was clearly unprepared for this level of confrontation. The host's usual arsenal of self-deprecating jokes and audience appeals were proving useless against Ford's unflinching honesty. "You want to know what's really funny, Jimmy?" Ford continued, his voice rising slightly. "A man who's never created anything meaningful in his entire career, sitting in judgment of people who've actually contributed to American culture. You're a parasite, feeding off the accomplishments of others." Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he struggled to regain control of his own show. The cameras captured every moment of his discomfort, every bead of sweat forming on his forehead as Hollywood's most respected curmudgeon systematically dismantled his carefully crafted image. But Ford wasn't finished, and what he said next would change everything. You know what really gets me, Jimmy? Ford's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that had made Han Solo's threats so memorable. It's not just the cheap shots at my age or my career. It's the fact that you represent everything that's wrong with this industry now. You've turned entertainment into a blood sport where the only way to get laughs is to humiliate people who can't fight back. The studio atmosphere had become suffocating. Camera operators zoomed in closer, sensing they were capturing television history. Kimmel's writers sat frozen in their seats, their usual rapid-fire joke suggestions dying in their throats as they watched their boss being systematically destroyed by one of Hollywood's most revered figures. Ford stood up from his chair, towering over the suddenly diminished talk show host. "I've watched you do this for years, Jimmy. Night after night, targeting actors, directors, anyone who's achieved something you never could. And the worst part? You hide behind this fake everyman persona while you're really just another Hollywood bully." Kimmel made a desperate attempt to regain control, gesturing frantically to his producers off camera. "Harrison, I think we should maybe take a commercial break here." "No." Ford's voice cut through the air like a lightsaber. "We're not taking a break. You wanted me on your show, you wanted content, well here it is. Let's talk about your real greatest hits, Jimmy. Remember when you spent an entire monologue mocking Brendan Fraser's comeback? A man who nearly died doing his own stunts, who struggled with depression and physical pain, and you turned his suffering into punchlines." The audience began murmuring uncomfortably. Some had their phones out, recording what was clearly becoming one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Kimmel's usual confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by visible panic as Ford continued his relentless assault. "Or how about your treatment of older actresses? You've made jokes about Helen Mirren's age, about Meryl Streep's appearance, about Dame Judi Dench's career longevity. These are women who've contributed more to cinema than you ever will, and you reduce them to age jokes for your audience of mouth-breathers." Kimmel finally found his voice, though it cracked with desperation. "Harrison, that's not fair. Comedy has always pushed boundaries. It's satire, it's commentary, it's cruelty," Ford interrupted, his legendary intensity now fully unleashed. "There's a difference between clever commentary and systematic degradation. You've chosen degradation because it's easier. It requires no talent, no wit, no intelligence. Just the ability to punch down at people who've actually accomplished something." The band leader exchanged worried glances with the show's producers. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable television into something approaching a public execution. Ford's decades of pent-up frustration with Hollywood's treatment of veteran performers was pouring out in a torrent of righteous anger that left no room for Kimmel's usual deflections. "You want to know what real comedy is, Jimmy?" Ford continued, pacing now like a caged predator. "It's finding humor in the human condition without destroying people's dignity. It's wit that elevates rather than degrades. But that requires actual talent, something you've never possessed." Kimmel made another, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, Harrison, I respect your career. I respect what you've done." "No, you don't," Ford shot back immediately. "If you respected my career, you wouldn't have opened this interview by mocking my age. If you respected what I've done, you wouldn't spend your time making jokes about actors who've given their lives to this craft. You respect nothing except your own pathetic need for validation." The studio had become a powder keg of tension. Audience members were filming openly now, sensing they were witnessing something that would be discussed for years to come. Ford's righteous fury was building to a crescendo, and everyone present could feel the approaching explosion. "I've worked with Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas. I've created characters that have inspired generations. I've put my body on the line, literally bled for my craft. And you think you can sit there and mock me? Mock us? You're not fit to carry water for the craft services table on any film I've ever made." Kimmel's hands were visibly shaking now as he gripped his desk. The cameras captured every moment of his humiliation, every drop of sweat, every desperate glance toward his producers for rescue that would never come. Ford had him cornered, and everyone in the studio knew it. "Here's what's really pathetic, Jimmy," Ford said, his voice building toward something seismic. "You could have been different. You could have used this platform to celebrate talent, to uplift artists, to actually contribute something positive to the culture. Instead, you chose to be a bottom feeder, a remora attached to the belly of real talent." The tension in the studio reached its breaking point as Ford prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be his final, devastating blow. Ford's eyes, locked onto Kimmel's with the intensity of a man who had faced down countless villains on screen and was now confronting the biggest one of all. "But you know what the most disgusting thing about you is, Jimmy? It's not even the cruelty. It's the cowardice. You only target people you think won't fight back. You punch down at older actors because you assume we're grateful just to be here, that we'll take your abuse with a smile because we need your show more than you need us." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kimmel's face had gone ashen, his usual quick wit completely abandoned as Ford continued his methodical destruction. The audience sat in stunned silence, many holding their breath as they witnessed the complete obliteration of a television persona that had taken years to build. "Well, here's a news flash for you," Ford continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I don't need this. I don't need your show. I don't need your platform, and I sure as hell don't need your disrespect. I've got more money than I can spend, more awards than I can display, and more respect from real filmmakers than you'll ever dream of having." Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Harrison, please, let's just what?" Ford exploded, his legendary composure finally completely shattered. "Let's pretend this is all some misunderstanding. Let's shake hands and smile for the cameras while you continue to poison the well of entertainment with your toxic brand of humor? Not happening." The cameras captured every micro-expression on both men's faces. Ford's righteous anger contrasted sharply with Kimmel's growing panic. The host's usual arsenal of self-deprecating jokes and audience pandering had proven completely useless against Ford's unflinching assault on his character and career. "You've spent your entire career hiding behind the excuse of comedy while systematically tearing down people who've actually contributed something meaningful to this world," Ford continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his 5 decades in Hollywood. "You're not a comedian, Jimmy. You're a parasite, a vampire feeding off the talent and dignity of others." The studio's atmosphere had become electric with tension. Security guards positioned themselves strategically around the set, unsure whether to intervene or simply document what was clearly becoming one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. Ford's decades of frustration with Hollywood's treatment of veteran performers was manifesting in real-time destruction of one of the industry's most prominent platforms. "And the worst part," Ford said, stepping closer to Kimmel's desk, "is that you've convinced yourself you're the good guy. You hide behind this aw-shucks everyman persona while you systematically destroy people's reputations for laughs. You think, because you're not throwing punches, you're not causing damage? Words have power, Jimmy, and you've used that power to spread cruelty and mediocrity." Kimmel's hands were now visibly trembling as he reached for his water glass, his carefully constructed television personality crumbling under Ford's relentless assault. The man who had made a career out of making others uncomfortable was now experiencing that discomfort himself, magnified and broadcast to millions. "I've watched you mock Robin Williams after his death," Ford continued, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. "A man who struggled with depression, who gave joy to millions, and you turned his tragedy into material. That's when I knew you weren't just unfunny. You were actively evil." The accusation hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face flushed red, then pale, as he struggled to formulate any kind of response. The audience gasped audibly at Ford's words, sensing they had crossed into territory that went far beyond typical celebrity feuds, into something much darker and more personal. "Harrison, that's not— I never—" Kimmel stammered, his usual eloquence completely abandoned. "You never what?" Ford shot back immediately. "You never made jokes about his mental health struggles? You never turned his pain into punchlines? Because I remember differently. We all remember differently. The internet remembers everything, Jimmy." The studio fell into complete silence except for the hum of cameras and the barely audible whispers of crew members who knew they were witnessing television history. Ford had systematically dismantled not just Kimmel's authority as a host, but his entire public persona, revealing what he claimed was the cruel and calculating man beneath the carefully crafted everyman image. "So here's what's going to happen," Ford said, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect on movie sets for half a century. "I'm going to walk off this set, and you're going to sit there and think about what kind of legacy you're building. Because while you're making jokes about other people's lives and careers, the rest of us are actually living them." Ford turned toward the exit, but then stopped and looked back at Kimmel one final time, preparing to deliver the blow that would end everything. "And Jimmy," Ford said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "when you're lying awake tonight, wondering how this all went so wrong, remember this moment. Remember that you had the chance to be better, to use your platform for something meaningful, and you chose cruelty instead. That's your legacy. That's what you'll be remembered for." The words landed with devastating finality. Kimmel sat frozen, behind his desk, completely broken, unable to formulate any response as Ford delivered his crushing verdict. The studio audience remained in stunned silence, many still recording what they knew would become legendary television moments that would be replayed for years to come. Ford straightened his jacket with the same dignity he'd brought to every role throughout his career. "You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy? When people talk about my career in 50 years, they'll remember characters that inspired them, stories that moved them, performances that changed their lives. When they talk about yours, they'll remember the night Harrison Ford made you look like the small, petty man you really are." With that final devastating assessment, Ford began walking toward the exit. But Kimmel, perhaps driven by desperation or wounded pride, made one last catastrophic mistake. "Harrison, wait!" he called out, his voice cracking. "You can't just walk out like this. We're live. You're under contract." Ford stopped dead in his tracks and slowly turned around, his expression now carrying the full weight of his legendary intensity. The studio collectively held its breath as Ford's eyes narrowed with the same menacing focus he'd brought to confronting villains in countless films. "Contract?" Ford's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of thunder. "You think a piece of paper gives you the right to humiliate people? You think because someone signs a contract, they forfeit their dignity?" He took several steps back toward Kimmel's desk, and the host visibly shrank in his chair. "Let me tell you something about contracts, Jimmy. I've been breaking them longer than you've been alive when they required me to compromise my principles, and I'll be damned if I let some third-rate hack with a fake smile and a mean streak hide behind legal documents while he destroys people for entertainment." The cameras captured every moment as Ford leaned over Kimmel's desk, bringing his face close to the trembling host's. "Your contract doesn't own me. Your network doesn't own me. And your pathetic attempts at intimidation sure as hell don't own me. I am Harrison Ford, and I walk away from bullies. I always have." Ford straightened up and looked directly into the main camera, addressing the audience at home with the same commanding presence he'd brought to Han Solo's final speeches. "To everyone watching at home, remember this moment. Remember that you don't have to accept being treated badly by people who think their position gives them power over you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. He turned back to Kimmel one final time, his voice now carrying a note of almost pity. Enjoy your ratings, Jimmy, because after tonight, when people tune into your show, they won't be watching for your comedy. They'll be watching to see if you have the decency to apologize for what you've become. Without another word, Ford walked toward the exit with the steady, measured pace of a man who had just delivered the performance of his lifetime. The studio remained in absolute silence as he reached the door, paused for just a moment to adjust his jacket, and then disappeared into the hallway beyond. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We'll be right back after this commercial break," he managed to say, but his words carried none of their usual energy or confidence. As the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, the audience remained in their seats, many still processing what they had just witnessed. Crew members exchanged shocked glances, knowing they had just been part of television history. The night Harrison Ford systematically destroyed Jimmy Kimmel's carefully constructed persona and walked away victorious. Within minutes, social media exploded with clips of the confrontation. Harrison Ford wins began trending worldwide as millions of viewers shared their reactions to seeing one of Hollywood's most respected actors take down what many had long considered late-night television's most toxic personality. The show's ratings that night would be the highest in Kimmel's career, but for all the wrong reasons. By the time the episode ended, it was clear that Harrison Ford had accomplished something remarkable. He had held a mirror up to the entertainment industry's culture of cruelty and shown everyone exactly what principled resistance looked like. Ford never returned to complete the interview, leaving Kimmel to fill the remaining time with awkward monologue attempts that fell flat, with an audience that had just witnessed genuine authenticity destroy manufactured persona. The confrontation became a defining moment that highlighted the importance of respect and professionalism in entertainment, proving that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply refusing to tolerate disrespect.